Good morning, Nigerian 2120.
Cleared for takeoff, 3-4 left.
What's that?
A mysterious sound.
So as soon as this aircraft took off,
You've got 4 low pressure lights.
there was basically no surviving.
The air brake thing just broke.
Smoke.
I'll take a look.
They think they've got a hydraulic problem.
You've lost all hydraulics.
A confounding series of failures.
Declaring an emergency.
We are having flight control problems.
Roger, I thought you were...
Saudi 738.
Now they have to grapple with this blaze.
There's smoke in the back, real bad.
A raging inferno.
This thing would have been like a torch. It's pandemonium inside the cabin. Bodies were falling out of the aircraft.
There it is, it's 2 miles out! Christ, I have no control!
And he had no idea what would ensue when he lowered that landing gear.
261 people
Landing gear down!
on the brink of disaster.
Mayday.
Mecca, Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. This is the holiest city in all of Islam. Making the journey to Mecca is a sacred duty in the life of every Muslim. The Hajj is the world's largest pilgrimage. This week, more than 1.5 million people will take part in the ritual. 80 kilometers away, one of the largest airports in the world is the gateway to Mecca for pilgrims traveling by air. Jeddah Airport has a terminal built exclusively for the annual Hajj. A terminal that can handle 80,000 passengers at a time. Today, in blistering desert heat, Nigeria Airways Flight 2120 prepares to take a group of Nigerian pilgrims home.
For most Westerners, a Hajj flight would seem almost surreal. These are very poor pilgrims from villages in Nigeria. They've never been on a plane for the most part. The whole cultural difference is amazing. I mean, there's stories told about some of these pilgrims getting into the airplanes and actually trying to light their barbecues to cook meals on the flights, not realizing that, of course, you can't do that.
The 247 passengers are on board a DC-8 that will be heading west across Africa to Sokoto, Nigeria. It's a charter flight operated by Canadian airline Nation Air.
The DC-8 was the primary aircraft for Nation Air. It was reliable, sturdy, and served us very well in operations throughout the world.
Nation Air was a scrappy little startup airline based in Montreal, and it started by taking people on vacations to sunny destinations during the winter, and it grew very rapidly. And then it had this very unusual offshore charter business, which is what brought them to Jeddah and Saudi Arabia.
By offering unconventional flights that most other airlines would never consider, Nation Air is giving its competition a run for their money.
Sir, you have to take your seat, please.
Captain William Allen is a former Canadian Air Force pilot. He has more than 20 years of flying experience. First Officer Kent Davidge will be at the controls today, piloting Flight 2120 out of Jeddah.
Let's close her up and get out of here. Starting 4.
You've got number 4 way up here.
Okay, starting 1.
Victor Furr
I'll turn on the aircon.
is the engineer on today's flight. There are two other Nation Air employees on the plane. Lead mechanic Jean-Paul Philippe and project manager Aldo Tetamanti.
Mr. Tetamanti was sent to Jeddah by our planning department to primarily provide logistical administrative support.
Flight 2120 must taxi 5 kilometers across the sprawling airfield to get to its takeoff position.
Flight controls.
Check.
It's a long way around.
Yep.
Good morning, Nigerian
120, cleared for takeoff.
3-4 left.
At 8:26 a.m., it's already 30 degrees outside.
Runway's clear.
All engines?
Okay, you have control.
I have control.
Stable.
Brakes released. Set max thrust.
Max thrust.
Davidge powers the DC-8 down the runway.
So early in the takeoff roll, they hear a loud sound in the cockpit. And the flight engineer says,
What's that?
The instruments show no indication of trouble.
they continue to accelerate.
80 knots. 90 knots now.
90 knots, check. Sort of a shimmy. Like if you're riding on one of those thingamajigs.
V1.
V1 is the speed at which pilots can no longer safely abandon their takeoff.
Rotate. Positive rate.
Gear up.
Nigerian 2120 airborne.
29.
Flight 2120 is now climbing through 1,500 feet. The plane has been in the air for 1.5 minutes.
You've got 4 low pressure lights.
What have we got?
You've got 4 low pressure lights.
Yeah.
We might be losing pressurization. Pressurization is uncontrolled.
The instruments indicate that the plane isn't pressurizing properly. But in the cabin, nothing seems wrong.
Level off.
Okay.
Nation Air 2120, we'd like to just level off at 2,000 feet, if that's okay. We're having a slight pressurization problem.
In the tower, the controller has his hands full. An odd coincidence is creating confusion. Another plane is reporting the exact same problem.
Say call sign.
The controller thought he was talking to one aircraft with a pressurization problem, when in fact there were 2 aircrafts reporting pressurization problems simultaneously.
I'd just like to level off at 2,000 feet.
Got a spoiler light.
Wing spoilers reduce lift when planes are landing. Since the crew hasn't deployed them, the light points to yet another malfunction.
Gear on safe flight.
You could descend.
Descend to 3,000 feet.
The controller believes he's talking to the other distressed plane, a Saudi Arabian aircraft.
Flying heading 160.
Nation Air is flying at 2,400 feet. Descending to 3,000 doesn't make sense.
There's so much confusion going on between the tower and these 2 aircraft. They're making a bad situation even worse.
Alan thinks the controller wants him to climb.
Heading 130, and understand you want us up to 3,000 feet.
That's affirmative. Fly.
Heading 160.
Heading 160.
We're losing hydraulics here.
The loss of hydraulics has significant implications in controlling the aircraft.
Okay, 160, and we're losing our hydraulics, sir.
You revert to what is called manual control, and it's already difficult with hydraulic assist, but manual control is even more difficult.
We're gonna need to come back to Jeddah to land.
Flight 2120 is 13 kilometers from the airport and flying away from it.
Roger, understand you are going to land in Jeddah?
To get back on the ground, the crew will have to make a wide left turn. It will take them further away from the airport before bringing them back over the city to line up with the runway. In the cabin, the first signs of trouble.
Smoke. I smell smoke.
Where? I'll take a look.
The Nation Air mechanic is about to discover the terrifying truth behind Flight 2120's mysterious mechanical failures. Amid growing confusion in the cockpit, the pilots of Flight 2120 still don't know that there's smoke in the cabin.
All they're dealing with is just all the alarm bells going off to indicate that equipment is failing left, right, and center.
But mechanic Jean-Paul Philippe realizes they're in serious trouble. An onboard fire has the potential to consume the entire aircraft in seconds.
The air brake thing just broke.
We got a flap slot light.
Less than 3 minutes after takeoff, passengers begin to notice something's wrong.
Okay, sir, we have a problem. We're leveling here right at the moment.
Level off right now. Right now, level off!
We're level 3.
The controller still believes he's talking to another plane.
Yeah, I will give you further instructions.
Descend right now, 3,000 feet.
Jeddah Airport is now 20 kilometers away. With the heaviest smoke at the back of the plane, passengers rush forward, desperate for air.
Okay, leveling at 3,000 feet, and if you could give us a heading back toward the runway.
We're declaring an emergency.
We'll advise you of the problem. We're declaring an emergency at this time.
Roger, confirm you would like to be runway 16.
No, 34 would be better. We're gonna need time to get ready for the landing.
So we have confusion between the two planes in the tower. We have, unbeknownst to the pilot and the crew in the cockpit, smoke billowing into the passenger's seat area.
There's smoke in the back, real bad.
Yeah, we're heading back. We've got a hydraulic problem, Kate.
So this is the first indication that the pilot has of anything going on in the back of the plane.
Should I tell the passengers?
Yeah, just tell them we'll be returning to Jeddah.
They think they've got a hydraulic problem. Now they have to grapple with this blaze that is spreading through the rear of the aircraft. So things are rapidly spinning out of control.
Okay, let's get squared away and see what we've got here, please.
In the cabin, it's becoming almost impossible to breathe. And Jeddah is still 19 kilometers away.
You've lost all hydraulics.
The odds on making it back to the airport are getting slimmer.
Damn it! I've got no ailerons!
Davidge can't steer the plane with no hydraulics.
Okay, hang on, I've got it.
Captain Allen struggles with his control column, but it too could fail at any moment.
Let's get lined up before things get any worse.
Okay, so we're at 2,000 feet now, declaring an emergency.
We are having flight control problems.
Roger, I thought you were Saudi 738.
Only now does the controller realize that the troubled aircraft is the Nation Air flight.
Turn left right now,
Heading 080, expect runway 34 left.
By this time, it's pandemonium inside the cabin. Passengers are being engulfed by flames, and bodies are starting to fall from the aircraft fuselage.
The plane is right over Jeddah, a city of 2 million people.
Bodies were falling out of the aircraft 11 miles from the airport.
Okay, sir, we're having trouble turning. We are having flight control problems. People try to turn left. We are having flight control problems.
In the situation, it would have made certainly controlling the aircraft for an approach and landing very, very difficult.
How much further? 10 miles. 1,700 feet.
Choking for air, some passengers try to open the doors. At this speed, it's impossible.
Jeddah 2120, clear to land runway 34 left.
Okay, we're coming straight in. We'll land on the left. Require emergency vehicles immediately. We have a fire. We will be ground evacuating.
Jeddah 2120, clear to land any runway, clear to land.
There it is, it's 2 miles out!
All right, let's get on the ground.
I've lost elevators.
Christ, I have no control. Landing gear down.
Saudi Air 738, Nigeria Airlines is down, just short of runway 34 center.
The fiery explosion and sudden impact with the ground has all but obliterated Flight 2120.
A trail of blackened debris stained the desert half a mile short of Jeddah's main airport. Little was left of the DC-8, such was the force of the impact.
247 passengers and 14 crew are dead. This is the worst accident ever for a Canadian airline. And the deadliest crash of a DC-8 in history. One day after the crash, a team of Canadian investigators arrives in Jeddah. They'll be joining the official Saudi investigation. They now must figure out how a DC-8 bound for Nigeria,
Nigerian 2120, airborne 29.
ended up in pieces just 10 minutes after taking off.
Has anything been removed?
We'd heard that there'd been an onboard fire, but really little more than that, beyond the fact that all the 261 souls on board had perished in the accident.
Bill Taylor is the Transportation Safety Board of Canada's technical expert.
My first view of the crash site was one of astonishment, really, at the spread of the debris, the severity of the breakup. Usually there's some indication of recognizable parts of the aircraft, but there was virtually nothing to identify it as an aircraft.
I can't even tell what most of this is.
It was critical for us to know what happened as quickly as possible because we're carrying millions of people all over the world, and so we wanted to know if we had a problem. Do we have a problem with our operation, our equipment, our aircraft?
The thing that impacts you is when you're dealing with 247 passengers and 14 crew all dead. That gets your attention. And the fact that something as big as a DC-8 is now lying there in a zillion pieces, all burned. Yeah, it has an effect.
I was responsible for performing a site survey which identified the location of the major parts of the wreckage and searching for evidence of the source of the onboard fire.
By mapping the spread of the debris, the investigators begin to get a picture of what happened to the DC-8 at the moment of impact.
The fuel sprayed out in a V shape and instantaneous fire over that area. Obviously what had happened as the aircraft hit the ground with a severe down motion, it ruptured all of the fuel tanks.
The main wreckage sprawls across a stretch of desert 400 meters long and 200 meters wide.
A body was found 11 miles back from the crash site, so the crash site actually starts 11 miles back, so it's like 12 miles of things falling out of the airplane and people falling out of the airplane. We did see that whole sections of seats were melted and charred, and obviously had people in them when they fell. And everybody was very bad injuries. Let's just leave it at that.
The most important question for investigators is, where did the fire start? But with so much of the plane so badly burned, it will be hard to plot the progress of the fire. They need to distinguish between pieces that burned in the air from those that caught fire on the ground.
Got a small bag? Yeah.
Damage from an in-flight fire is usually considerably greater than ground fire because of the extra heat developed from the airflow, giving a blowtorch effect. And the effect on the metal is to heat it to the point where it's almost molten, whereas in the post-crash fire, it's an even coating, and any material that melts drips straight down.
The wreckage from the front of the plane shows the least amount of fire damage. Remnants from the center fuselage are the most severely burned. This indicates that the fire likely began in the plane's mid-section.
The center fuel cell had been penetrated by the fire because there was one part of that wall that you could see a clear burn-through pattern in the wall.
We found that the tail section of the airplane was covered with molten aluminum, indicating that the airstream had brought parts of the melting airplane back.
It's clear the fire grew hot enough to melt the fuselage before the plane hit the ground. But how the fire started is still a mystery.
Let's get all these pieces back to the hangar.
The Saudi government provides a hangar for the investigators to conduct a more in-depth analysis of the wreckage. The lead investigator on the case is the Transportation Safety Board's Ron Coleman.
The Saudis didn't have the expertise on the ground or in the area and hadn't done any major accident investigations that I was aware of. And also, they didn't have any engineering lab capability, and we did, so they opted to let us do that work for them.
Let's put together what we can.
We knew that parts of the airplane had melted, and part of the cabin had burned away underneath the passengers. We know that aluminum melts at 1100 degrees Celsius approximately. So this thing would have been like a torch.
Before investigators can reach any conclusions about what caused the crash, Nation Air puts forward a theory of its own.
Early on, Nation Air claimed that a foreign object, a hunk of metal, had been on the tarmac at Jeddah.
Nation Air makes that claim after learning remnants of blown tires were found on the runway.
However, the Saudi aviation authorities said there was no evidence of any foreign object on the tarmac at any time before or after the crash.
Canadian investigators now face two very different but equally disturbing possibilities. Either Nation Air is rushing to judgment about why one of its planes went down, or the Saudi Aviation Authority is attempting a cover-up. Examining the remains of Flight 2120's landing gear, investigators discover that the wheels may have had something to do with the crash. One of the left wheel rims shows clear signs of having been scraped along the runway.
This is the number 2 wheel that was recovered from the accident site. You can see here the area where the wheel was ground down.
You can imagine the kind of heat that would generate running along the runway, scraping off.
At the crash site, Bill Taylor makes a chance discovery. It adds an unexpected new layer to the investigation.
I noticed a piece of paper blowing across the site. Picked it up, and I could see that it was handwritten notes on this paper, and it turned out to be part of the A-flight inspection checklist, and it was the actual page that recorded tire pressures.
Hey.
The maintenance checklist shows that the tires were inflated to normal pressure. What is not normal is that there are 2 different colors of ink, with a second entry written over the first.
It was apparent that the numbers had been changed at some point.
It didn't look right. We recommended that we send it to the RCMP for them to look at it and see if it had been altered or documented, because there is a law in the aviation industry that no documents shall be altered. And this one looks suspect.
The plane's flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder have been recovered. Though it's far from certain whether any data has survived the intense heat and heavy impact.
We packaged them and transported them back to the Canadian lab for analysis.
Tire tracks on the runway offer some intriguing clues about what happened to Flight 2120.
Left main landing gear had been leaving marks, rubber marks, to begin with.
So this is the outer left one.
These continued for some distance, and then we see where the inboard front tire of the left landing gear had lost its tire. In other words, the tire had blown and the wheel had come down into contact with the runway.
From rubber marks on the runway, Taylor concludes that the aircraft blew 2 adjacent tires, both from the left main landing gear.
What's that?
It's an important discovery, but they still don't know why the tires burst, nor how that could have led to the catastrophic fire.
Let's spread it out, see what's what.
Investigators next examine pieces of tire found on the runway. They're looking for any signs of a defect or heavy tire wear.
Visual examination found that the tires had sufficient tread to continue in service. They were worn, but still pretty good shape.
The discovery supports Nation Air's claim. It's possible that the DC-8 did, in fact, hit something on the runway that caused a puncture.
Press releases at the time provided by the president of the company stated that the cause of the tire failure was debris in the runway.
Even with 2 blown tires,
Positive rate.
Flight 2120 got airborne. The connection between the blown tires and the calamity that consumed the plane still isn't clear.
Okay, let's get squared away and see what we've got here, please.
In Ottawa, the Transportation Safety Board has salvaged the cockpit voice recording. But instead of solving the mystery, it only adds to it.
What's that?
We got a flat tire, you figure?
The voice recorder confirms that the crew suspected they had a blown tire.
You're not leaning on the brakes, eh?
The pilot flying is the only one that has his feet on the rudder pedals on the takeoff. The rudder pedals are also the brake pedals.
No, I'm not. I got my feet on the bottom of the rudder.
It can happen from time to time that you touch the brakes, either for directional control or inadvertently. And I assume that that's what the captain thought, that he might have inadvertently touched the brake pedals.
It's common for pilots to take off with blown tires. It's considered less dangerous than aborting a takeoff at high speeds.
Tire failures at the time were not an uncommon event, nor are they today. You take off successfully, continue en route, and land at destination without adverse consequences.
Okay, we're leveling at 3,000 feet, and if you could give us a heading back toward the runway.
The Nation Air crew finally does declare an emergency.
We're declaring an emergency. We're advised of the problem. We're declaring an emergency at this time.
It's then that the air traffic controller realizes his mistake.
Roger, I thought you were Saudi 738.
There was another flight coming inbound that was having problems, and the air traffic controller thought that he was talking to the other aircraft.
Roger, confirm you would like to be...
Investigators wonder if that confusion contributed to the disaster by delaying the DC-8's return to Jeddah.
No, 34 would be better. We're going to need time to get ready for the landing.
But after studying air traffic communication transcripts and analyzing the flight path, they determined that the mix-up did not add any time to the return journey.
As it turns out, this didn't have any effect on the eventual crashing of the aircraft.
The question remains, could a blown tire have somehow led to an intense fire that took down a commercial aircraft in 10 minutes? At the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Forensics Lab, technicians have analyzed the Nation Air maintenance log. Tests reveal 2 layers of ink on the log entries.
The readings for the tire pressure were written over, and the actual readings that were underneath showed 20 to 30 psi below the required levels to operate the plane and tires safely. So the only conclusion that you could make from that is that the entries were falsified.
Tell me what the plan was for the tires.
With this troubling new information, investigators now turn their attention to the mechanics who last worked on the plane. They learn that 4 days before the crash, at a stop in Ghana, Africa, mechanics wanted to change the tires. The tread was beginning to wear, and the pressure was low. The investigative team wants to learn more about how Nation Air managed day-to-day maintenance. Bill Taylor is joined by operations expert Larry Vance.
What we did was look at all the operational issues, and we looked at human factors, basically everything that had to do with the operation of the aircraft.
You're not going to believe what I just found.
Taylor uncovers evidence that the tire change was never carried out. A fax from the Nation Air project manager in Jeddah ordered it stopped so the plane could stay on schedule.
They had a facsimile come in from the project manager.
Forget it. They want us to get going.
Saying that some of their passengers were being given off to other carriers, which put some pressure on them to abandon their plan to change the wheels.
It was felt it would have caused a greater delay.
So the fax came in and said, stop the tire change. We're way behind. We may lose the contract. Load everybody up and get back. And so they did. They stopped the work. Because Nation Air is go, 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 go. Nobody wants to deal with anything that could delay the departure.
Rather than top up the tires, a mechanic altered the log to make it seem like the tire pressure was fine.
There's no indication that they ever added pressure to the tires to actually inflate them to that. They just simply made the books look right.
3 days later, the plane landed in Jeddah with the same underinflated tires. At 5 a.m. the following morning, the crew arrived for pre-flight checks. "20 minutes before takeoff, lead mechanic Jean-Paul Philippe finally decided to get the tires topped up.
He had waited for quite a long time. I believe the passengers were on board and the baggage was on board. Basically, the flight was ready to leave when he finally decided it was the right thing to do to try and get nitrogen.
All the tanks are empty.
Aircraft tires are inflated with nitrogen, not air. Nitrogen does not expand as much as air. It's also less flammable.
He actually made an attempt to find nitrogen to top the tires up.
Listen, I just need to top up 2 tires. That's it.
Philippe asked another airline to help.
I just need to top up 2 tires.
They had nitrogen bottles, but they were empty. That didn't go very well. It was reported to us that the project manager just simply said, forget it. We're not going to get nitrogen. We're going to go without topping up the tires. And away they went.
He's not a commercial pilot or a trained mechanic.
Investigators now conclude that the project manager's lack of experience was a critical factor in the accident.
He was making operational type decisions on behalf of or instead of some of the people who should have been making the decisions themselves and putting a stop to things like allowing the aircraft to fly with underinflated tires.
Oh, let me guess, we gotta go.
It was something new and was to have actually assisted us in being better prepared and operating more effectively. In hindsight, the irony is where the reverse actually happened, that additional pressure was put on the crews.
Any decision to take off with an unworthy airplane or tires that were low ultimately should have been communicated to the captain, because the captain is the person that's responsible for the safety of the airplane and the crew.
But that didn't happen. No one in the cockpit was likely aware the tires were underinflated before takeoff.
I don't think this flight engineer would find it significant to see that values and the tire pressures were changed, as that is not an unusual occurrence on a journey log. Incorrect values are entered and they're changed or fixed.
Before it crashed, claiming 261 lives, the same plane took off and landed 7 times with the underinflated tires. Records show that the plane's loaded weight was about the same for each flight. So why did the tires blow on July the 11th at Jeddah?
How long is that taxiway anyway?
Investigators suspect the answer relates to the sheer size of the airport, combined with extreme desert temperatures.
It was something like 11 minutes of taxiing with several turns. So it was a long taxi before they even started the takeoff run.
They taxied for 5 kilometers. The tires must have been burning up on the tarmac.
The DC-8's main landing gear consists of a left and right bogie, each with 4 wheels. Uniform tire pressure is important. It ensures the weight of the plane is distributed evenly between all 8 wheels.
When you have an underinflated tire, that total weight then is distributed over the remaining wheels. It would be felt on the axle mate of the low-pressure tire.
We calculated, using our weight and balance figures, that the pressure for that day would have been 183 psi. It's pretty clear from the RCMP investigation that one of the tires was 155 psi.
That's 28 pounds per square inch below the safe level. Added to that, the effects of a long taxi run on a scorchingly hot taxiway.
During taxi, there's an opportune time for tires to heat, and particularly tires that are underinflated, to heat up, flex, and so on.
When you get over-deflection or excessive bending in that area, it generates heat. You generate enough heat, the nylon begins to melt and pulls apart. Tire blows.
What's that?
The first tire to burst was not the low one, but the one right beside it.
90 knots now. 90
The
knots
underinflated tire blew next. The wheel rim hit the runway.
And when that started to drag and wear down the runway, it got super hot.
Hot enough to ignite the rubber tires. The crew took the fire into the air with them, and it quickly consumed the plane.
So as soon as this aircraft took off and they retracted the landing gear, there was basically no surviving.
Gear up.
The fire was going to spread.
There's smoke in the back, real bad.
They were going to crash.
Yeah, just tell them we'll be returning to Jeddah.
It's all over 10 seconds after they lift off.
When the aircraft got airborne, positive rate, gear up, and the gear went into the wheel wells on fire.
Unfortunately, the DC-8 did not have any heat or fire indication to tell the crew that they had a problem with the landing gear, the wheel well area.
The fire begins with this tire.
Investigators now know where the fire started and why it spread so quickly.
The left wheel well burns first.
Using the remnants of tire and perhaps hydraulic fluid as the fuel, this fire continued to burn in the wheel well.
We might be losing pressurization. Pressurization is uncontrolled.
Next, this bundle of wires, wiring for the spoiler light.
Got a spoiler light.
Fire's spreading fast. It's reached here, the main hydraulic line.
We're losing hydraulics here.
By now, the fire's reached the very top of the wheel well. It's eating through the emergency wheel brake.
The air brake thing just broke.
Then the fire hits the right wheel well, and this bundle of wires shorts out the flap slot light.
We have electrical wires, we have hydraulic fluid, all highly flammable.
We got a flap slot light.
And you've got the air rushing at you at 240 knots.
Now, the fire breaches the wheel well, making its way up towards the cabin, burning through the aileron controls on the first officer's side.
Damn it! I've got no ailerons!
Clearly, a fire in the wheel well is a very dangerous thing because of what's in the wheel well. This is the way the airplanes have been designed, and they function fairly well until something like this happens and we find out, oh, perhaps that wasn't a very good place to put this.
Once it's burned through the main fuel tank here, it's all over.
He had no idea as to what would ensue when he lowered that landing gear.
Landing gear down.
The fire had compromised the structure to the point where when this action of lowering the gear took place, it destroyed the airframe.
The official accident report, issued almost 2 years after the crash, found the DC-8 was unfit to fly.
I don't believe that the people who were making the decisions had in their heads that this was a hazardous thing that they were doing.
The report lists several causes for the crash, including the lack of fire prevention equipment in the wheel wells and the decision to release the plane with underinflated tires.
The mechanics working on this aircraft were not fully aware of the hazard involved in low tire pressures.
A number of critical changes came about after this accident. Smoke, fire, and temperature sensors in the wheel wells are now mandatory on all modern aircraft. Most critically, all crews are trained on the importance of properly inflated tires.
Forget it. They want us to get going.
The accident was a major factor in the collapse of Nation Air in 1993.
The accident, I think, was probably the beginning of the end. Our emphasis of production over protection really identified the main weakness in the company.
Oh, let me guess. No, we gotta go.
You can only pressure your people to cut corners so many times and put pressure on them to keep to schedule so many times and put dollars ahead of safety so many times before something will go terribly wrong, like it did in this Nation Air crash.
A passenger plane is obliterated in the California hills.
There were no wings, no fuselage. There was no tail section. There were no aircraft seats.
Hardened steel is ripped to pieces.
This was the worst damage I've ever seen.
The wreckage paints a grim picture of the final moments of Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771. The plane reached impossibly high speeds.
They tell us that it actually broke the sound barrier.
Passengers experienced crippling G-forces.
We assessed the impact forces around 5,000 Gs.
It would have been a horrifying experience, the final few seconds of their lives.
Whatever brought down Flight 1771, investigators are certain of one thing. It was not an accident.
Mayday, Mayday.
Los Angeles International Airport, one of the busiest in the world. Every year, 40 million passengers arrive and depart through LAX. At Terminal 1, a group of passengers and crew bound for San Francisco are making their way through security. A short while later, they board Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771.
Pacific Southwest really was what we'd call a large regional airline at the time.
Maybe you set me up with a scotch on your way back?
They had service in about 30 cities all over, mostly the western part of the United States.
The flight from Los Angeles to San Francisco is one of the most popular routes at Pacific Southwest, also known as PSA. Among the 38 passengers are several PSA employees, including the airline's chief pilot.
It's very common for airline employees to commute between cities for work, and so people would take a bus to work. Many airline employees take a plane to work.
Captain Greg Lindemood has been flying with PSA for 14 years. The father of 3 is also a decorated combat veteran.
Brakes. Brake set. Flaps up. Spoilers retracted.
First Officer James Nunn only joined the airline the previous spring. He's also logged thousands of hours in the cockpit.
Thrust levers.
Today, they're piloting a British-built BAE 146 commuter jet. With quiet turbofan engines, it's designed for short-haul flights over densely populated areas. The flight to San Francisco will take just over an hour.
So do you know what you're getting the boys for Christmas?
Well, it's gonna be Nintendo, and with what it costs, I think they can both share it.
Anything to drink, guys?
I'm fine, thanks.
Okay, just holler if you change your mind.
Flight 1771 is cruising at 22,000 feet above the California countryside.
Can you ask him how it's been?
Just over halfway through the flight, Captain Lindemood worries about the mild turbulence.
Center, PSA 1771. Any reports on the ride ahead? We've had a little continuous light chop.
PSA, this is Rocky Mountain Center. It's not too bad.
My
God, that was a gun.
Yeah.
The crew now has a much bigger problem on its hands.
Squawk 77, Squawk 77. We've had a gun fired on board the aircraft.
You want to go to Monterey? Could you make it, sir?
Moments later, Flight 1771 falls into a steep dive.
Witnesses caught a brief glimpse of the aircraft as it was plummeting down from the sky.
It was going at a high rate of speed. Looked like a dart just diving to the ground.
Flight 1771 crashes into an isolated hill 280 kilometers northwest of Los Angeles. Police get to the crash site and find a 30-ton airliner obliterated.
There were no wings, there were no fuselage, there was no tail section, there were no aircraft seats. There was just papers everywhere. And the strong smell of aviation fuel.
It doesn't take long for Sheriff Steve Bolts to reach a grim conclusion. No one has survived the crash.
We're making a frantic search throughout this remote cow pasture looking for survivors, and we can't even find deceased human beings, much less human beings that had survived.
Most catastrophic aircraft accidents happen on takeoff or landing. A shallow impact angle can sometimes leave large sections of the plane intact, giving passengers and crew a chance at survival. The 43 people aboard Flight 1771 had no chance at all. This is one of the worst air disasters in California history.
Come on up here, guys.
The day after the crash, investigators from both the National Transportation Safety Board and the FBI are on the scene.
You ever seen anything like this? It's gonna be a long day, guys.
We knew that gunshots had been heard by the air traffic controllers.
Squawk 77, Squawk 77. We've had a gun fired on board the aircraft.
If the reports of gunshots were accurate, then I realized immediately that we had crime aboard an aircraft, for which the FBI had primary jurisdiction.
But the reports may not be accurate. The pilots and controllers may have been mistaken. Even though speculation about the gunman's identity is widespread, it's up to the NTSB to determine exactly what happened on Flight 1771.
One of the things you have to avoid in accident investigation is preconceived notions. For example, most of us never turn on the radio, never watch television on the way to the scene, because even though you might not consciously be aware of it, you can get front-loaded with information, and when you get there, you may subconsciously start looking for things to substantiate that background. So you try to arrive on scene with a totally objective view of what's going on.
While NTSB investigators try to determine the cause of the crash, law enforcement agents have questions of their own.
It's establishing who had motive, establishing who had access, establishing who was the intended victim.
Right there. They should be somewhere right in there.
The FBI is searching for evidence of a crime, the NTSB for clues about the crash. If they can recover the black boxes, they may find both.
With the total destruction of the aircraft, I mean, you had limited amounts of information that you could gather from the wreckage.
At this point, the most important thing is to get the cockpit voice recorder and get away from the speculation and see what the cockpit voice recorder tells us factually.
The flight recorders tell the tale of what happens to the aircraft. They're very important in reconstructing the events that brought the airplane down.
The impact comes in this way, right at the tail. They should be somewhere in here. think that's it.
After hours of searching through the shattered remains, the effort finally pays off. They recover the plane's 2 black boxes.
The first recorder that was recovered was the cockpit voice recorder, and that was recognized by its orange cover and all that was still, although badly mangled, was still recognizable as a recorder.
The second black box has suffered even heavier damage. The flight data recorder captures critical information about the aircraft's performance.
What a mess. What a mess.
It had been so badly mangled, it wasn't recognizable as a flight data recorder.
Both recorders will be sent to the NTSB laboratory in Washington. It is far from certain whether the data they hold can be successfully retrieved. Without it, investigators may never know what happened on Flight 1771.
That's about the first thing you do when you get on scene, find the cockpit voice recorder. You can't overemphasize how important that was in this case because we had no airframe left to work with. We really had no wreckage in the normal sense of the word.
At the NTSB laboratory in Washington, Dennis Grossi examines Flight 1771's badly damaged cockpit voice recorder.
The case itself was basically crushed. It was bent in like somebody grabbed it and pushed it together like that. And this is hardened steel, and we assessed the impact forces around 5,000 Gs just based on the deformation of the crash enclosure.
The recorder, the aircraft, and everyone on board suffered an impact force 5,000 times the force of gravity. The world's best fighter pilots can handle a sustained force of 9 Gs. In a crash, the human body can sometimes survive 100 Gs for a split second. A force 50 times as strong is difficult to comprehend. Dennis Grossi knows the immense impact may have ruined any chance of hearing the last words from the cockpit of Flight 1771.
No crash investigation is routine, but among the jigsaw puzzle of pieces from Flight 1771, investigators are looking for something very different, perhaps a gun.
Finding the weapon could help the FBI identify who might have fired shots on board Flight 1771. But for the NTSB, gunfire alone does not explain this accident. A bullet should not bring down a modern commercial jet.
There's a lot of misconception about decompression and about whether or not for example, a single shot could bring down an aircraft. And if it's simply a shot through the fuselage of the aircraft, the answer would be no.
It takes a much larger hole in the fuselage for there to be an explosive decompression. The kind of hole that led to one of the deadliest air disasters of all time. In 1974, a faulty cargo door blew off Turkish Airlines Flight 981. The decompression caused the cabin floor to collapse, severing the flight control cables. The crash killed all 346 people on board.
The aircraft would normally not come down just from a bullet hole with no other implications. It just wouldn't be enough to cause an explosive decompression, which is what you almost have to bring the aircraft down.
If a gunshot didn't bring the plane down, then investigators need to find out what did. At the NTSB lab in Washington, work to recover Flight 1771's cockpit voice recording has produced a surprising result. Despite suffering huge impact forces, the audio tape is still intact.
All right, let's give it a listen.
The first 28 minutes of the tape reveal a routine flight.
It's gonna be Nintendo.
The crew was trying to find out when the turbulence they had been flying through would end.
Can you ask him how it's been? Center, PSA 1771. Any reports on the ride ahead? We've had a little continuous light chop.
PSA, this is Rocky Mountain Center. It's not too bad.
We hear the flight crew talk, do their normal procedures.
But in the final 2 minutes, events take a chilling turn.
Sure sounds like a gunshot.
And then all of a sudden, they hear, and we hear on the recording, this gunshot.
The tape confirms what the pilots had reported. 2 gunshots.
God, you know a gun? Yeah, I know.
Squawk 77, we've had a gun fired on board the aircraft.
It was actually a very sobering moment because we realized that we were listening to 2 people communicating with each other, the pilot and the co-pilot, in a very routine flight that suddenly became anything but routine. It was something that one doesn't quickly forget.
Investigators listen as the situation becomes increasingly disturbing.
The door to the cockpit was heard open, and a female voice, presumably the flight attendant, was heard to say in a voice that was filled with alarm,
There's a problem, Captain!
And we heard a voice, a male voice, which we presumed to be the captain, saying, "What's the nature of the problem?"
What's the problem?
I'm the problem.
Investigators now know for certain that the killer was a man and that he shot the flight crew.
It's always startling when you hear something like that, when you hear the commission of a murder. As accident investigators, you just don't hear that. This was a very unusual recording.
A flight attendant and both pilots are shot.
That's 5 shots so far.
and then we could hear the cockpit door shut again, and another final shot, the 6th shot.
Before the tape ends, they hear one last ominous sound.
The plane's in a dive. The engines are over-revving.
Within about 5 seconds, we picked up what's called windscreen noise. In other words, you could tell that the aircraft was accelerating.
That noise increased in its pitch. We learned, of course, that it was going into a dive at that point.
65 seconds after the murder of its crew, Flight 1771 smashes into the California hills.
It helped us to understand what we were investigating, the heinousness of the crime that we were investigating.
The CVR recording changes the NTSB's role in the case.
Let me know if I can help.
It just confirms that this wasn't an accident, that it was, in fact, a crime, and the FBI would be taking over the investigation from here on out.
The FBI, bear in mind, knows how to investigate crime. They don't necessarily know how to investigate an aircraft accident. So we would go ahead and do our normal investigative procedures and make that information available to the FBI.
The FBI is investigating a murder, but solving it is now just one of their priorities.
I'm the problem.
The CVR recording has highlighted another pressing issue.
Somehow, someone managed to get a gun on that plane.
A weapon was smuggled through LAX, one of the world's busiest airports. Investigators wonder how the shooter managed to evade airport security.
Let's find out how that guy got on the plane, all right?
If the FBI can't find answers soon, more lives could be at risk. 2 days after the downing of Flight 1771, investigators are still combing through the wreckage for a piece of evidence rarely found at a crash site. A murder weapon.
That's a hydraulic line, probably from the main gear.
The search for the gun was very frustrating because we knew that that played a major role in what had happened. We needed to know for sure that the gun was there. I mean, it's a supposition, pretty good supposition that there is a gun involved.
We weren't sure that we would succeed because the field of debris was so wide and the impact had reduced the airplane to so many small pieces.
While the search for the gun continues in California, NTSB investigators in Washington try to determine what caused Flight 1771 to go into a sudden dive after the crew was shot. Dennis Grossi believes the answer may lie in the shattered remains of the FDR, the flight data recorder.
The internal magazine that held the tape was the only part that was actually recovered. The rest was not recovered.
Worse still, almost all the tape that records data is gone, torn from the machine when it's slammed into the ground.
This was the worst damage I've ever seen.
Grossi examines a critical part of the recorder, the tape heads that lay down data onto the magnetic tape. He finds a tiny piece of recording tape has survived.
The magazine didn't survive, and the tape itself was destroyed, except for about a 6 to 8 inch piece of tape that ran around the recording heads and the capstan.
With such a short piece of tape, it's doubtful there will be any useful information on it at all.
We worked real hard at trying to get all the data that we could off of that little piece of tape.
Investigators in California finally find what they've been hunting for: the barrel of a gun.
The gun was found by one of the FBI agents pretty much in the middle of where the aircraft impacted.
We were very, very fortunate when we found the gun. It was an unbelievable stroke of luck.
It's not just any gun. It's a .44 caliber Magnum.
A .44 Magnum was considered the most powerful handgun that you can have.
But the barrel alone isn't enough. They need the rest of the weapon. Fortunately, they find it. The cylinder with 6 spent cartridges.
Its frame is very powerfully constructed, so for it to tear the barrel off just suggests the power of that crash impact.
The shattered pistol leads to a morbid discovery.
When we found what was left of the gun, there was a portion of the finger between the trigger and the trigger guard. That went back to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia.
Lab analysis may help solve a mystery that hangs over the entire investigation. The FBI has a weapon, a crime scene, and 42 murder victims. What's missing is proof of the identity of the 43rd person on board, the killer.
We, in our investigation today here at the site, have located a weapon, and that weapon is going to be examined, and of course any connection between it and the crime will be more fully developed.
We needed to determine a motive for why someone would do such a thing. Somebody would have had to fire those gunshots, and there had to be a reason for it.
It's part of a seat, part of the frame.
Really, as far as the investigation on scene, it's totally NTSB, as far as the kick in the tin, if you will. But we were able to answer questions that might arise from the FBI investigators on scene. As I say, they don't have the expertise to know what to look for, but from the criminal aspects of it, they certainly know what to ask about.
Part of a frame.
At the crash site, the NTSB has recovered a piece of wreckage that could help explain what happened on Flight 1771. A fragment of a passenger seat.
We actually found a seat that had a bullet hole in it.
If they can determine exactly where the seat was located, then PSA's passenger seating records could give investigators the name of another one of the victims shot before the plane went down. Dennis Grossi has done all he can to salvage data from the small fragment of tape recovered from the flight data recorder.
I was able to decode that little strip of tape, and I got the last seconds.
It does contain data, but only 6 seconds worth. Investigators learned that in its final moments, the aircraft was operating normally, with no mechanical problems, except for one thing. Someone had pushed the control column forward, forcing the plane into a steep dive. The aircraft accelerated to the speed of sound.
Went in from 22,000 feet with cruise power on all 4 engines.
Investigators now understand why only very small pieces of wreckage were found at the crash site.
When the aircraft hit at such a high speed, it impacted and basically compressed the Earth, and then they released and it blew everything back out of the hole.
The heavy impact propelled some debris straight back into the air before it could be singed by the explosion.
All the light material, all of the paper on the aircraft, any the insulation material on the aircraft, all that light stuff got blown up into the air, and then the wind carried it for, I believe, miles.
The fact that the plane was forced into a dive explains why PSA 1771 crashed so quickly. It also adds even greater urgency to the FBI investigation. Since it was almost certainly the killer's hand on the controls, this is now the worst mass murder in California history. But investigators still don't have enough evidence to be certain who the killer was, nor who he was trying to kill. Was it the work of a madman who wanted to commit mass murder? Or did the killer target one particular passenger and coldly sacrifice everyone else on board? The FBI investigation into the onboard shooting and fatal crash of PSA Flight 1771 has uncovered a lapse in security at LAX. It may explain how a gun was smuggled onto the aircraft.
Any number of people in the airport could bypass the security screening that was going on.
Agent Bretzing learns that airline employees with valid identification are allowed to bypass security at LAX.
What they had set up is a bypass for crew members and airport employees, actually anybody that had the proper badge. You would show your badge and they would allow you to bypass both the metal detector and the X-ray unit.
It was a big loophole.
Bretzing knows the killer was a man, and from Flight 1771's passenger manifest, he can see that there were 4 male passengers who worked for either Pacific Southwest or its parent airline, US Air.
It's one of these guys.
We suppose that he did in fact bypass security, carrying the weapon.
Investigators need to prove conclusively who smuggled the gun on board. At the FBI laboratory, forensic specialists analyze the piece of skin found in the trigger guard. A technician is able to get a fingerprint from the skin fragment. In search of a match, he compares the print to those on file for the 4 male passengers who could have bypassed security. And he finds a match.
There was enough of the forefinger that they were able to peel open and then match it.
Just days after the crash that claimed 43 lives, the FBI has positively identified their killer.
That was a key element in the investigation.
His name is David Burke.
David Burke cleaned the airline. He was one of those employees who would go in after it landed and help to clean up the inside.
Investigators now know David Burke smuggled a gun on board Flight 1771. What they now need to explain is why.
A motive gives you understanding. It helps to develop the full mosaic of the crime. Knowing the motive, you're able to conclusively determine what happened.
Day 3 at the crash site. Still sifting through the strewn remains of the plane, investigators uncover a bizarre but telling piece of evidence. One that points directly to the motive behind David Burke's crime.
During the search, one of our people found an air sickness bag and knew immediately that it was a pertinent piece to the puzzle.
Because he pushed the plane into such a steep dive, Burke unwittingly ensured that the vital clue could be discovered.
The air sickness bag had a very ominous message pinned on it.
Burke had written the unsigned note during the flight. He expressed a grudge against a man called Ray.
Hi, Ray. I think it's sort of ironical that we end up like this. I asked for some leniency for my family, remember? Well, I got none, and you'll get none. That was the message that we recovered from that air sickness bag.
The air sickness bag is the conclusive clue they've been searching for, the clue that establishes David Burke's motive. The Ray in the note is identified as Airlines station manager Ray Thompson. He worked for PSA's parent company, US Air. He was also David Burke's former boss.
Ray Thompson was the supervisor.
By now, Bretzing has also learned that Burke had a troubled history, both with the company and with the law.
Burke had worked for US Air for 14 years, most of them at the airport in Rochester, New York.
There was allegations of criminal activity when he was back in Rochester.
Burke was someone they had watched carefully for narcotic trafficking and larceny.
Allegations that Burke smuggled cocaine on commercial flights were never proven.
Well, basically, he just apparently stayed one step ahead of us. But the bottom line is that he wasn't charged.
He moved to the West Coast, presumably to kind of get away from the heat, if you would.
But 3 weeks before the crash, Burke ran into more trouble. He was fired from the company after being caught on tape helping himself to the in-flight bar proceeds.
He had stolen some money from the fund that the flight attendants used when they're making change, and he had stolen what amounted to $69. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back.
3 weeks after being fired, Burke was given an opportunity to appeal.
Mr. Burke had been terminated several weeks prior to the flight.
Thanks for coming in, David.
He then came back for an appeal hearing on the day of the flight.
I've reviewed your file.
He was terminated by Ray Thompson.
Your appeal, it's been denied.
Under intense financial pressure, Burke was near the end of his rope.
Why you gotta be such a jerk?
That termination interview was not a placid one.
My decision's final, Mr. Burke.
Thank you very much.
As he left Thompson's office, Burke made a remark that hinted at plans for revenge.
The secretary had said, David, I hope you have a nice day. And David Burke, the suspect, paused at the door, turned to her and said,
Oh, I plan to have a very nice day.
When he was fired, he still had his credentials. Got to remember, this was 1987. Security was a lot different than it is now.
What you got there?
Investigators now know that in the days leading up to the crash, David Burke went from a grieved ex-employee to a man coldly planning murder. Now they need to find out all they can about his movements on the day of the crash.
What can you tell me about David Burke?
After his meeting with Thompson, he went to his locker, possibly to get the gun.
But he went to his locker the day of that flight, prior to the flight. Whether he retrieved his gun from the locker or not, we are not sure.
Instead of returning to the office, Burke decided to buy a ticket for Flight 1771, a flight he knew Ray Thompson would be on.
Ray Thompson lived in San Francisco, and he flew regularly on that flight to return to San Francisco at the end of the day. It was common knowledge among the employees that Ray Thompson would be on that flight.
Why Burke opted to kill so many others along with his former boss is a question that defies rational explanation.
The average person certainly would not act with the rage and the vengeance that had to consume David Burke prior to this act. One can only imagine that there must have been something else wrong with David Burke.
He just decided to take it out as an act of revenge against the company. I don't know that there's any other motivation that we can come up with.
It's clear Burke's attack on Flight 1771 was meticulously planned. But exactly how events unfolded once his rampage began is still uncertain. NTSB investigators have provided a big piece of the puzzle. They've been able to match up the bullet-punctured seat fragment with an exact onboard location, row 4, seat C. Records show that on Flight 1771, that seat was unoccupied. But the seat directly in front of that empty seat was occupied by Ray Thompson. The finding points to the sheer power of Burke's .44 caliber handgun. His first 2 shots pierced not 1, but 2 airline seats.
The bullet hole would have been made as the bullet passed through Ray Thompson and then entered that seat and left a bullet hole there.
They now know that Burke shot at least 4 people during his rage-filled assault on Flight 1771. Ray Thompson and 3 crew members. That accounts for 5 shots. But investigators heard 6 shots on the tape. They must account for them all. The gunshot sounds were picked up by a microphone in the cockpit. By comparing the sound pattern of each shot, investigators can determine if they were fired in the cockpit or the passenger cabin.
The shots that were fired in the plane, not in the cockpit, but in the plane, were distinct but muffled.
Other shots were louder and clearer, indicating they were fired closer to the CVR microphone.
The shots that were fired in the cockpit were very loud. We had 3 shots that were fired outside the cockpit and 3 shots that were fired inside the cockpit.
Investigators don't know who was shot with the final bullet, just that it was fired in the cabin. It's enough for them to finally piece together a picture of the horrific final moments on board PSA 1771.
What the hell?
You can imagine what Ray Thompson must have thought as this person whom he had just terminated a few hours before walks past him in the airline, hands him this note, and then probably goes into the men's room. And he's reading this note with its ominous message.
Next, they hear the sound of the lavatory door opening.
So we're assuming that he handed Ray the note, went into the restroom, where he took out the gun, came back out, we heard the door close again, just before the shots.
Ray!
Ray Thompson probably has the most merciful of all the deaths on that plane.
In less than a minute, a routine flight has become a nightmare.
There's a problem, Captain!
What's the problem?
He was very careful. He had done the planning thus far fairly well, and we believe he followed through with that plan.
I'm the problem!
It wouldn't take much knowledge or experience on a passenger part to know that they were in deep, deep trouble.
There's a problem, Captain!
after shooting his former boss and 3 crew members. David Burke pushed Flight 1771 into a dive and left the cockpit. The airline's chief pilot was now the only person on board who could pull the plane out of the dive.
An off-duty pilot may have been moving himself forward to try to render whatever assistance he could once he realized something drastic was happening.
What the hell are you doing? You gotta let me in there. Don't do this. Come on.
But Burke had 1 bullet
What
left.
the hell are you doing?
That may have accounted for the 6th shot. There are some who speculate that David Burke was taking his own life. The evidence suggests otherwise. Had David Burke been taking his own life, the gun would have fallen from his hand after he had shot himself.
But since a fragment of Burke's fingertip was recovered from the trigger guard, Bretzing reasons that the killer was alive, holding onto the gun until the very moment of impact.
Alarms were sounding in the cockpit. There was increased noise of the plane plummeting. Then just before impact, it became silent. They tell us that it actually broke the sound barrier. Of course, it would have been a horrifying experience, the final few seconds of their lives.
One man's rage meant 2 minutes of pure terror for 42 people.
The FBI believes 1 man was responsible for the crash of PSA Flight 1771 in the hills of San Luis Obispo County, in which all 43 on board were killed.
With all of the evidence that we have recovered here, that we would have more than sufficient to charge David Burke with the violation of the air piracy statute.
The unprecedented crime is solved. But aviation authorities are left with a troubling question. Could it happen again? The tragedy of Flight 1771 provoked action from the Federal Aviation Administration. The body that regulates the airline industry took urgent measures to tighten security.
The FAA came out and canceled the bypass authority, so therefore air crews and employees would have to go through the normal screening as any passenger would.
Now it's required that any employee that leaves an airline, whether they've been fired or quit or retired or whatever, must turn their credentials in immediately. Getting on an aircraft with a gun now, I won't say that it's impossible, but it's next to impossible.
But the new measures would not prevent the world's deadliest hijacking incident. The 9/11 attacks would usher in sweeping new airline security procedures.
After 9/11, several security gaps were certainly plugged.
There are now federal air marshals on board many domestic U.S. flights.
These are armed officers that are on flights in plain clothes.
Cockpit doors have been reinforced with Kevlar, and they stay locked throughout all flights.
The doors are built so that they're very hard to get through. They're ballistically sound. If David Burke was on a plane today, when he got to the cockpit, he couldn't have gotten in with the weapon he had, so he would have been able to still injure or kill people in the back, but he could not have brought the plane down.
Finally, many domestic airline pilots are now allowed to carry firearms. All of these measures have made flying safer, but nothing can completely eliminate the risk of another David Burke.
Well, in my view, aviation security has been heightened tremendously. But we still have a ways to go, and aviation will always be a target.